Hi everyone, I'm Daniel, and today I'm going to walk you through a list of some of the scariest enemies that I could think of in Arkham Horror, the card game. This is going to be a somewhat short list, but it's based on some of the experiences that I've had playing the game. As such, there's going to be a little bit of campaign spoilers, so buckle up. First thing I want to do, of course, though, is talk about how I came up with the list. What makes an enemy scary? Now, notably, all of the enemies on this list are recurring enemies and they are non-elite. I also don't have any victory points. I think the ones that have victory points are not that scary because you're really trying to kill them and they tend not to get in your way too much. Now, as far as non-elite goes, I wanted to make sure that these weren't, boss enemies. Those are, of course, scary, but they tend to come up at predictable times. So you're not really thinking that I might just accidentally draw one of these during the Mythos phase and then be in some trouble during your turn. You know when they're going to show up, especially on repeats. That's kind of brings us to the next point is these are recurring enemies that really demand that you have a solution for them that is not the usual one. And when you're playing through a campaign for the first time, you probably aren't teching for that particular solution. So these enemies to me are pretty scary because they ask something very different of you, and you might want to include various cards your second time through to deal with them. You'll see as we go along. All right, let's go for the first one. And this is going to be the Fang of Yig. Actually, you're going to note that a lot of these choices aren't just enemies that have tons of health or do tons of damage, but they have other text on them that makes them pretty tough. All right, so this is in the Forgotten Age, and it's a 3/3/3 monster. This is not really that hard to deal with. It's all the rest of the stuff that is tough. It's got Retaliate. I think Retaliate is a very scary keyword on investigators for investigators that are not super good at fighting. If you don't have a big weapon out, this matters a lot. Sometimes, even if you do have a big weapon out, you draw a -5, an auto fail, something else that's worse, and the consequences really are dire. You get set back quite a bit. In this case, it's not doing you anything extra than the 1 damage and horror on the Retaliate, but what are the cases in which we're going to might be failing an attack, though? So the rest of the text here. While Fang of Yig is engaged with a poison investigator, that investigator cannot play cards or commit cards to skill tests. Well, how do you deal with this enemy? You need to have already put out a weapon, a spell, something like that. And if your plan going into the campaign was, be Nathaniel Cho or something, or use your Spectral Razor, not being able to play cards is really tough. What are you going to do? Just do some basic punches? That's okay for, maybe Nathaniel, but for other investigators that really need to use their cards, this is really difficult. Committing cards to skill tests also really hard. This is a 3 health enemy, and if you don't have Vicious Blow or something that you would otherwise use, right, because you can't use it here, then you need to spend extra actions to get rid of this guy. His solution, of course, is twofold. You could evade and walk away. There's no hunter on this enemy, although in the scenarios in which he appears, that may not matter so much. You may need to go back through his location later. And then there's the question about poison. Just don't get poisoned, right? But I've played plenty of the Forgotten Age, and you do get poisoned. It's something that you try your best to avoid, but is it really your fault if you are poisoned? Sometimes you take a very difficult test, you fail it, and then you're just poisoned. And maybe your way of getting the evade out here is to commit a skill card, because 3 evade is not that easy to just pass even if you've got 4 or 5. It's very easy to fail those. So this guy, I think, is a roadblock. There's 3 of them, I believe, in the encounter deck. Maybe it's just 2. I think it might be 3, though. And if you draw them at the wrong time or engage with the wrong investigator, or you're playing solo, for example, this is trouble. It seemed really easy on the tin, but in practice, I think it's actually quite difficult. And I am very happy that the Return to Forgotten Age got rid of this guy entirely. All right, let's move on to the second one, which is the Avian Thrall from the Dunwich Legacy. Some big numbers here. 5 fight, 4 health, 3 evade. And the prey doesn't matter so much, I don't think. It is a hunter. You're going to try to get rid of this guy as quickly as you can. However, you've got this text that makes it hard to fight him. I mean, 5 fight is pretty tough. He does show up towards the end of the campaign in a couple scenarios where it does matter. There may be a lot of enemies on the board, and it's hard to just get away from him. But you can do the fight. What I think is kind of funny here, I mean, I don't think this is the toughest one on the list here, but if you don't have a ranged firearm or spell asset, then you're having a hard time here. And I highlight that asset part that maybe they didn't have spell events back in the day, but your Spectral Razor doesn't do much here. I mean, it gives you maybe a better chance of dealing with the high combat score here, but Occult Invocation, Blood Eclipse. There's other things that are spell events that you can't use, which is pretty funny. I think newer cards changed it to spell card. But otherwise, bring your guns, bring your ornate bow. Then it's actually pretty easy to deal with. So this one's like kind of lower on the list, but it's always been a classic. You plan playing Dunwich because of this guy and because of a different enemy that's not on this list that really cares about you. Using melee weapons. So using melee weapons is bad in this campaign, or at least not optimal. So this is just another one of those on the list. Now let's move on. Number 3 is a new one from Feast of Hemlock Vale. And again, this is just a 3/3/3. The Miasmatic Shadow doesn't seem that bad, but the rest of the text here and the context in which the enemy appears, it's quite a few scenarios actually, makes it a lot tougher. So just like the previous one, we've got some restriction on how you can damage it. Well, previous one made it harder. This one, you just can't damage it at all unless you have spell, relic, science, or encounter cards. So you need to pack one of these because otherwise you need to be able to evade, and evading them is not that easy either. So if you're a fighter, actually it doesn't even matter who you are, right? Because this guy is aloof, but he'll follow you around, and when you discard one or more cards from your hand at his location, if he's ready, engages you, makes immediate attack. Now, in the daytime, that means he's stuck with you. And that is extremely annoying because then how do you get rid of him? You need to evade. If you have a spell or relic or science, then you can maybe get rid of him, and thankfully he's got victory on him, so he goes away entirely. But the campaign does a lot of making you discard cards when you aren't expecting it. And this is a problem at night. In the couple of times when he shows up at night, elusive makes him so that he hits you and then gets away. So now it's just harder to get rid of him entirely because then you have to move, engage, just to even try to eliminate him from the board. Yeah, a Spectral Razor goes a long way here, but if you don't have that sort of tech, then you are going to be in a world of hurt. Not much more I'm going to say about that. It's just a tough enemy that forces you to play around him in ways that's really difficult to do, or you bring some cards that lock him down. And this is things like Transmogrify for one, could leave him somewhere. Handcuffs ain't gonna work. That would work on a few other enemies we'll see. The Persuasion puts him back into the encounter deck. Things like that will work, but you have to plan for that, right? And part of the point of this list is what are problems you're going to run into if you didn't just put a generic list of cards into your deck. Okay, the Spawn of Holly. This is from the Path to Carcosa, and this is a chunky enemy. 4 health. Maybe that doesn't sound like that much, but with 4 combat, which sometimes goes up in one of the scenarios, especially that he shows up in, and 2 evade. 1 damage, 2 horror is really hard on a retaliate enemy. So you've got 2 choices. You can try to chunk through the health and deal with the retaliate, and that's probably what you do if you draw it on a fighter that says, I guess this is what I'm here for, but if you miss, it sets you back quite a bit. The other thing you could do is you can evade, and you can then walk away because this guy does not have Hunter at all. However, if you successfully evade by 2 or less, you take 1 horror. so you get hit on the way out. That's probably the way you want to do it. And only 2 evade makes it possible, but the reality is a lot of investigators don't have a good way to just evade. So that's just like not part of your game plan, especially if you only have 2, maybe even 3 to begin with. It's hard to just get away. And it's eating up a lot of actions to do that, but maybe this is teaching us we should have these other tricks up our sleeve for when an enemy like Spawn of Holly shows up. I've had campaigns go awry where a fighter who's like up by 4 tries to, get rid of this guy and then is kind of stuck driving the auto fail or -5, and then you're almost dead. You try to do the evade, it fails. You get hit again. I mean, retaliate again with all of this damage and horror means if you don't pass, you're going to get hit back during the enemy phase. So you really want to do the evade, but that's not always that easy, even with just a 2 evade. The Deep One Bull. Innsmouth Conspiracy. This card probably shows up in everybody's list for scariest enemies. And the reason why is because it's really hard to get rid of him. You've got a few options. There's the 5 health route. Again, 4 combat, 4 fights makes it pretty hard to deal with. The 2 evade makes it seem like, yeah, okay, I could maybe evade and run away. But after an enemy is defeated, a deep one enemy at any location, this guy readies and moves towards that investigator's location. So evading him and walking away is not a good solution. By the way, to add insult to injury, whenever he engages you, you have to choose and discard a card from your hand. That's okay. I mean, if you're playing a deck that doesn't care about that so much, it's fine, but you don't want to do this multiple times. You don't want to keep re-engaging this guy. So even if you do an evade, you need to get out. Not always possible in this campaign. Usually it is what you want to do. You want to move as quickly as you can, but this guy starts to be a problem in some of those more claustrophobic maps, which you would think is not the case in Innsmouth, but there actually are a few cases where you can get cornered and you have to be thinking about how far away is the Deep One Bull. The reason why this guy makes the list almost universally is people love to put handcuffs on him. He's humanoid, and then he just gets locked down for the whole scenario. If you have to put a card in your deck that is specifically teching for an enemy, and to be fair, he shows up in at least half the campaign, it might even be 5 scenarios, then the guy's scary. If you have to do something that is not just, I have my machete, I have my runic axe to deal with enemies, then, I mean, you could use that. Those would be fine, right? But if you are even thinking about doing that, then the enemy is scary. Number 6, speaking of, this guy doesn't look that bad, right? Brotherhood Cultist. If you can get rid of him, then it's really good. But if you start fighting him, and it says here, when you attack and initiate attack against Brotherhood Cultist, place 1 Doom on him, and then he gets +1 fight and +1 evade for each Doom on him, you better get rid of him in as few attacks as possible. Whether that's a Spectral Razor, and now it's just a fight of 3, that's great. But the moment you start doing multiple attacks, it's really tough, and then the evade to get away is a lot worse. So, again, this guy can ruin your day. There's more solutions nowadays. I kind of put him here, and I don't, like I said, I didn't want to, but he's a little bit lower on my list, and there's no order on the list in general, by the way. Just because I think that with String of Curses, you have an instant solution here. Spectral Razor, there's more ways to deal 3 damage at once. So I don't think he's as scary as he once was, but he can be the reason why you lose a scenario. Because Doom, we haven't seen that on any other enemy so far, gets you into more trouble than just taking damage and horror, especially in the few scenarios that he shows up where advancing the agenda early means something. So, yikes. He also can get Doom placed on him from other effects, so you might not have a choice in the matter of what his fight is by the time you get around to it. Draw this guy, draw Mysterious Chanting, and then you are wondering what you're going to do. So, scary enemy, but bring a String of Curses. Let's go to number 7, and this is a similarly strange addition because we've got low fight and evade numbers, but man, there's a lot of chunky enemies in Edge of the Earth, and I think for the most part, they're okay. You don't have to do too much different to deal with them. Some of them show up right away, and I think they can be tough, but the only the giant albino penguin is the one that scares me because he looks like you can ignore him, and then suddenly everyone loses an action to try to leave. It's funny. He's aloof and 3 health. So your options are kind of I can ignore him and lose 1 action and just leave. But with more people in that location and more reasons why you want to go back to that location, that seems like a bad idea. You'll be losing actions in the long run. Okay, well, your other option is to just engage him and then do the damage, but that's going to cost you basically your whole turn anyway. That sounds good, except for in the scenarios that he shows up in, which is the latter half of the campaign, there's a lot of reasons to move and move quickly. Whether it's other treacheries that landed on a location that you're already in, or other enemies that are in the location, it's kind of a difficult situation, especially if he shows up the wrong time. So, very very scary enemy, which doesn't seem like it, but it makes you do things unconventionally, I suppose. And again, that aloof keyword does so much work here. There are other good enemies in the campaign, but I went with this one because it's kind of classic. And like I said, you just have to play a little bit differently and not optimally. There's also another encounter card that spawns them. So while there's only 2, there's actually 2 more that if you just choose to ignore the penguins, you place doom on the ones that already exist. And then you say, oops, I guess I need to go back there. And then that's actually even a worse proposition. So I guess, sorry, you don't have to put doom on them. You can bring them to your location, which might be the right call too. All right, one more on our list. And I feel like it's kind of cheating because this guy does not show up in more than one scenario. Well, sometimes he shows up in the end of the core set, but we're looking at the Circle Undone here. And, you know, we hope to see him show up in more campaigns because he's part of the core set. But the Goat Spawn is a very scary enemy. Got that Retaliate keyword. Only 1 damage, which isn't much. But 3 health and showing up in scenario 1, in a scenario where you really have to deal with a lot of these guys at once, and they might respawn, especially if you're by yourself, it can be an issue. It's something like where if I'm playing the Circle Undone, I know this shows up in scenario 1, I need a plan. And it may not be a plan that I like, but you know he's showing up. So kind of back to the whole thesis of the video, if you are playing around an enemy and you are building a deck around an enemy that shows up, even one that seems so innocuous like this one, it's a scary enemy. It's forcing you to do something different. Everyone taking horror from the on defeat, I think, is really tough too, because it suggests that you do deal with the enemy on your own, but that's not always possible. There's other versions of this effect in that campaign, but they aren't really recurring enemies, so I went with the Goat Spawn just to make things kind of fun. It's just such an iconic part of that first scenario. And that's it. I just have 8. I think there are other very scary enemies out there. Like I said, there's bigger ones. There's ones that have more, health, damage they deal, victory points, all the rest. But these guys all show up and can ruin your day if you don't have the right solution. So that's what makes them scary to me. And they can really end a scenario prematurely if you didn't have a good way to deal with them. I think there's a lot of good scenarios that have a one-off version of that. Carcosa has a bunch of them that sort of just ruin your day if you don't know what you're doing. But I don't think they show up enough for it to make on this list. So there you go. Okay, not so fast. I actually had an idea at the last minute to add in a few cards here that I mentioned all along so you can see them that I think are good tech cards for these enemies in particular, but in general, just something to put in your deck for something that you might not expect. Of course, which one should you put in? It's going to be String of Curses or Spectral Razor, like all the time. Okay, one at a time here. String of Curses. This is a spell, so it helps you deal with some of those enemies that care about spells. And you choose a non-elite enemy, you automatically evade it, place a doom on it, and then you get a clue out of that. So you actually just get rid of them for that turn. Cool, good panic button. However, if it has one or more doom on it already, then you just defeat it. It doesn't matter how much health it is, doesn't matter if it has victory points, goes into the discard pile or into the victory display. Really, really strong effect if you can get Doom on there on purpose, or if it's one of those enemies that just collects Doom on their own. Wait till this guy, the guy who picks up Doom, play this, and then you're set. It's really cheap, and you even get refunded for that. So that's really, really nice. I think that the Mystics have a lot of good tech here, and we're going to see more of it on the next slide too, but Seekers also do as well, which is nice because they're likely to need a solution when an enemy spawns on them and they don't have any way to deal with it. I think Transmogrify is really good because it's not just you solve the enemy right now, you also solve the enemy probably forever. So you evade using your good number and not probably your bad number, and then the enemy gains massive, you get a clue, and then it can't move. So it's kind of a problem on that location next turn, but you can just leave. This is a really good way to deal with any annoying hunter enemy that you just don't have a good way to deal with. And you know what? If you defeat it, if you don't want to defeat it because there's something bad that happens on defeat, then this is really nice. Doesn't work for everything, right? Doesn't work for other enemies that you do need to remove from play because they have Doom on them. Spectral Razor is the one-stop shop. It's a strong, strong card because at level 0, being able to have a fairly big number to attack and do 3 damage to non-elites is great. Guess what else is great? The extra action that it gives you to immediately engage the enemy. So those penguins, goodbye. 3 health is kind of the sticking point in this game still. Odd numbers of health usually is a problem. So having a card that can eliminate an enemy in one action, and most of these enemies were aloof and had 3 health, so it was kind of an issue. And this is a spell, like what doesn't it do, right? The only thing it doesn't do is return to your hand. You need to pay 2 XP for that, but that's a very strong upgrade. All right, let's move on to the next set. These, I think, are interesting ways to deal with enemies that defeats them as well. Waylay and Whispers of Doom are similar cards. So Waylay is a 3-cost event in Survivor. We haven't really seen Survivor much here. This one you need to evade or somehow otherwise exhaust a non-elite enemy, and then you test Agility X, where it's that enemy's evade value. If you succeed, you just defeat it. Again, this is like String of Curses. It sends it to the discard pile or the victory display. A lot of enemies have a low evade score, but a high fight score. So if you can somehow evade that Spawn of Holly and have 3 resources and take another test, now it's just gone. Maybe not the best idea for the ones that are not hunters, but this is a great way to deal with the Deep One Bull for sure. Okay, I do think the card has gotten better over the years simply because the resources are less of an ask that they used to be, but it does cost a few actions. Or maybe, someone else does the exhausting and you do the waylay test. But anytime you see a campaign that has really low evades on some big enemies, it saves you so much time. So I have had a lot of success with this in Innsmouth and Edge of the Earth in particular. All right, Whispers of Doom is the new one. This is basically another version of Spectral Razor in my mind because it is a parlay and you get to choose a non-weakness enemy at your location. You don't need to do the engage like you did with Spectral Razor. So you can pick aloof enemies or ones that are engaged with someone else. You do have to do a test, and the test could be pretty difficult, but you are a mystic probably, and you can make that work. You can also use Flying Clothes to make it easier. Just defeating the enemy, or if it's an elite enemy, putting 3 damage on it is really, really good. It's an expensive card, but putting a lot into this is probably not a big ask for you. So I would definitely encourage throwing this into a deck or 2. I've tried it out. It's really good. Persuasion, I'm high on this card, probably more than most people. The taboo version is you choose any non-weakness enemy. I think it's, yeah, still non-weakness enemy, not just humanoids. It's templated just like Whispers of Doom. That's what it's doing here on the page. And the test is similar, gets increased with the enemy's horror value. If you succeed, you don't defeat it, so it's not that nice. However, you just get to shuffle the enemy back into the encounter deck. This effect for Seekers in particular, or anyone else who can take it but probably can't take Whispers of Doom, is strong because it removes the enemy from the board. I can't I can't say enough about that. I know you might draw it again, but that's not the whole purpose of defeating enemies. Defeating enemies removes them from being a problem now. You might not draw it later, or maybe you don't care if you draw it later. You'll be in a different position then, and you can deal with it in a different way. Let's pretend the enemy had 3 Doom on it. Why not play this? The Doom goes away, and then you're free to take several more turns before the agenda advances. That's really good. So this works with, again, aloof enemies too. So you can shuffle a penguin back in, again, with the taboo version. Last set here. I mentioned these before, handcuffs being good for the Deep One Bull. It's just a way to solve the enemy, and then you don't worry about it ever again since it never readies. It's also good for the cultists that get Doom because now you can't place Doom on it. Fend Off is a 3 XP version. Oh, by the way, there's a 2 XP version of handcuffs as well, which is 1 cheaper, I think, and fast. Okay, and I think it removes the Doom that's already on the enemy as well. Fend Off is like a 3 XP version of all this, and it's not great, but it just kind of does the thing without making you spend some extra actions. So I guess that's good, but unless you can get the enemy to spawn at your location and like on purpose when you know the right enemy, right, spawns, it's hard to make this line up correctly, and it doesn't solve the Doom problem. So um, you don't want to fend off on a penguin because the penguin's forced effect still kicks in. So it only works on some enemies, I think. And then kind of as a joke, Dynamite Blast just represents testless damage. If you've got a penguin in a location, maybe throwing dynamite over there solves the problem. And maybe that means taking 3 damage to your face, and that's kind of bad. But maybe that is your solution, and I think Guardians mostly have the deal damage solution. If it's testless, that does solve a lot, right? So think about some of those enemies that when you attack them, something bad happens. And there's more than what was on my list. There's a lot of them that do things like when you initiate attack, you know, discard cards or something. This, especially if you're not even engaged with them, can be really good. Or if it's in a location that is somewhere else, then sometimes when the enemy is defeated, everyone at that location, something bad happens. Well, here, with Dynamite Blast from a connecting location, not a problem. So it's just another way. There's plenty more good enemy tech cards. I think still Spectral Razor does almost everything you'd ever want. So that's kind of the one to add in by default. But a lot of players, knowing the campaign they're about to play, or maybe something in their own decks, like a weakness enemy, which I didn't mention here at all, you might want to add these in just for planning purposes. Okay, that's it for the little extra bonus. Thank you all for watching, and thank you for supporting me over the past few years. Lots of cool new stuff to come. I'm looking forward to the Drowned City coming out. There's actually a card that I didn't put on the list, even though I know it's in here, that does something very similar to some of the ones we saw. So exciting to see that one, and we'll be able to talk about those very soon. All right, that's it. Bye.